Thank you, Mr. Chairman, over here. 2 weeks ago, President Trump ended Qasem Soleimani's brutal reign of terror that killed and maimed countless Americans and coalition forces and threatened many, many more to come. I urge all Americans to unite behind the president's defensive decision to strike one of the world's most powerful terrorists who was organizing attacks against Americans in Iraq, in defiance, I might add, of UN Security Council Resolution 2231. He shouldn't have even been in Iraq, shouldn't have been in Beirut, shouldn't have been in Damascus. For far too long, Tehran has been permitted to act with impunity against U.S. allies' interests and its personnel. I applaud the president for making our red lines clear to the Iranian regime that attacking Americans is never acceptable, and when American lives hang in the balance, Iran will be held to account for its actions. The Middle East is a safer place when the United States is clear and consistent in its intentions. Mr. Hadley, to what degree are Iran's proxies dependent on Tehran for financial, material, and technical assistance? And how successful has the United States been in preventing Iran from providing significant support to these proxy groups?
I'm not privy to intelligence anymore and haven't been for a long time on these subjects. My understanding is that the economic pressure that Iran is now under has resulted in some diminishment of the resources that are available to these groups. I think, for example, Nasrallah, who's head of Hezbollah, has actually complained that he doesn't have enough resources for his activities. So I think it is having effect based on what I've read in public sources, but I don't have the kind of intelligence sources available to me that would allow me to give you a better answer to that question.
Well, I thank you. They've clearly gone through the $150 billion plus that were sent over by the Obama administration, strapped to pallets to be used for these proxies to kill people around the globe, including our American allies and assets. After the Iranian regime admitted that it shot down Ukrainian International Airlines Flight 752, tragically killing 176 passengers, and I know it's been discussed here at length, protests did erupt across the country. Mr. Hadley, how are these protests connected, do you think, to the pro-democracy, pro-economic reform demonstrations of the last few years? And do you think that this public outrage will constrain Iran's foreign policy? Can it be constrained?
It's been interesting to see how many demonstrations there have been in the last 2 years of people demanding accountability from their governments, ending of corruption, less sectarianism, governments that actually perform. You've seen it in Algeria, you've seen it in Sudan, you've seen it in Lebanon, you've seen it in Iraq, you've seen it in Iran, a lot of other places in the Middle East. This is a positive thing, and I think it is one of the sources of leverage on the Iranian regime that may make them willing to come to the table and negotiate an outcome, because they put down the demonstrations in October and November only by a fairly brutal use of force. And I think they are worried that the additional sanctions will kindle a return to those kinds of demonstrations that could threaten the regime, and is a threat to the regime, as Richard Haas said, that might bring them to the table.
I absolutely agree, and that's why I also share your bullishness on the opportunity that we have at this moment of time to bring Iran to the table for further negotiations, more now than ever. And these protests and the public outrage, I think, could really have an effect as we go forward in foreign policy and such. So there are reports that indicate that Iran has worked to reduce internet connectivity near universities, hotspots, limiting the impact of these protests. How vulnerable is the regime to information operations, and how should the U.S. be using information to target the regime's weaknesses and empower this change? Mr. Hadley?
Well, they have cut off the internet to keep demonstrators from organizing as a part of their suppression of public demonstrations, clearly. You know, our best information operation has always been truth and trying to get it to the people in these closed societies, because what is really the toxic element for them is actually truth about what's happening in the world. And I think we have not done as good a job as we should in getting truth available to people in these totalitarian or authoritarian societies.
I agree. My time has expired. I shall yield back, but here is to truth and the Iranian people.